We are in the afternoon session, as is obvious to us all now. Those of you who are making your way in, kindly settle down, and let's now get into this session. And I think we all fed. I think one of the things we can appreciate is that when you come to an event such as this, an Africa-China event, you must eat well. And I think you can attest to that. There was enough food for everybody. So I think with that, we have sufficient energy to engage robustly for this afternoon session. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. David Munyae, our host, to take over from this and take us through the next session. Welcome, David.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This time I would like to invite the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Tshilidzi Marwala, to address us. I have a long bio of my boss, but I won't go through all of it. VC.
I think you can clap for me. Thank you very much, Dr. David Munyae. Of course, we know Dr. David Munyae as a famous face from the University of Johannesburg on CCTV. His Excellency Minister Dr. Akebe Kubai of Ethiopia, the Ambassador of the People's Republic of China, His Excellency Lin Songqian, and other embassies and high commissions represented. The University of Johannesburg, not too long ago, gave an honorary doctorate to the President of the People's Republic of China, and the ambassador accepted the award in his honor. So please give him a round of applause. Esteemed speakers and chairs who have traveled from far and to join us here today, representatives of various enterprises, UJ staff and colleagues from other institutions, students from UJ and other institutions of higher education. Please, let's give students from UJ a round of applause. You see, our students do a summer school in China. We have been doing it for a number of years now. And one thing that we want to do is to strengthen the relationship between the peoples of Africa and the peoples of China. So distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Sanibonani. Dumelang. Ni hao. Thank you very much. This conference is a testimony to the deepening relationship between the People's Republic of China and the African continent. Not too long ago, maybe a little bit long ago, about 12 years ago, there was an article on the magazine, Time magazine. You still remember a magazine called Time magazine? And the title of this article was that China is colonizing Africa. I actually replied to that article, and Ambassador, you can go and check my reply on that article because they did publish it, where I was questioning the motives of the people who claim that China is colonizing Africa. I think the relationship between China and the continent of Africa has to be mutually beneficial. I think that is very, very important. It has to be mutually beneficial, and it is mutually beneficial. The African students are amongst some of the largest foreign students in the People's Republic of China. We here at the University of Johannesburg, we have just sent 14 master's and doctoral students to the People's Republic of China to complete their master's and doctoral degrees. So therefore, this theme of the conference, Understanding Africa-China Industrial and Infrastructural Cooperation, Drivers and Prospects, is very, very important. It is very important because the fortunes of the African continent shall not be unlocked unless we do something about our infrastructure and unless we do something about our industries. So the concept of industrialization, because when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, many people, some amongst us, tend to think that the fourth industrial revolution is the end of industrialization. Yes, South Africa has deindustrialized, but I think with a bit of deep thinking, understanding the complexity of the South African society and its capabilities, and directing it towards certain goals, we can actually be able to industrialize much of our economy. Of course, the relationship between the People's Republic of China and in particular in South Africa manifests itself in many different ways. On the economics, the trade between these two countries is actually going up. In fact, the trade between the continent of Africa and China, it has been increasing quite extensively. We always say that, Ambassador, that if it was not because China had a strong relationship with the continent of Africa, the trade disputes with the United States would have had much more severe consequences. I think it has been very beneficial for us to say, yes, as we interact with everybody around the world, which we should, that this relationship between China and certainly South Africa, in the political space, through mechanisms such as BRICS, in the economic space, in mechanisms such as trade, in the society space, where there is exchange of people between China and South Africa, that these attributes actually unlock a great deal of economic value that we have to exploit. When we were awarding an honorary doctorate to President Xi Jinping this year, Ambassador Lin Songxian highlighted the importance of and the depth of China's relationship with the University of Johannesburg. Of course, we know that the University of Johannesburg is the first university that outside China that President Xi Jinping accepted a degree. It did not happen in North America, it did not happen in Europe. It happened in Africa, and especially here at the University of Johannesburg. I think you can give us a round of applause. During that ceremony, Ambassador Lin announced that the Chinese embassy was awarding 25 scholarships to successful students who intend to go and study in China. I know we did not give you 25 students, we gave you 14. We are going to give you the rest. So I am actually quite happy to announce that 4 months later, the embassy has fulfilled its promise and selected students, and the students have already left, and they are in China studying topics such as engineering, artificial intelligence, aeronautics, and social sciences. One of such students who is studying in China is a young man from Orange Farm. Orange Farm is one of the most depressed part of our society. He is doing, his name is Sibusiso. Sibusiso is doing a PhD in artificial intelligence. In fact, now is his final year there in artificial intelligence at Beiyang University in Beijing. And what Sibusiso is doing, he is monitoring, he is training artificial intelligent machines to monitor the normal behavior of rhinos. So you have a camera that looks at rhinos, whether they are in a park or, and then just monitor the behavior. And according to his thesis, if there is a change in behavior which can be detected using artificial intelligence, you probably can assume that there is an intruder. And of course, the final product is supposed to prevent poaching of our national resource, which include rhinos. So education is very, very important for us. We believe that Africa's 1.3 billion people will not move out of poverty without education. We believe that education is very, very important, not only for industry, but also for leadership. We also believe that if you do not know, you should not be allowed to lead. Those who are lazy to study must never be brought into close proximity to the levers of power. Because it is actually quite simple that the world is very complicated. If you are the leader of a country, you have to deal with issues of trade. It requires knowledge. It requires the ability of taking lots of information, advices. Heads of states have huge amounts of advisors. Even a vice chancellor like myself has lots of advisors. I mean, I will have an advice from David Munyai saying you shouldn't say this speech. By the way, he once said that when we were visiting. He says, no, this line must be removed, Of course, it will be 10 different people telling you what you should do with one thing. You as a leader must have the wisdom to know which choices to make in order to maximize utility of your nations. That is why education is very, very important. When the People's Republic of China was modernizing, it was during the time of Deng Xiaoping. In 1978, and Deng Xiaoping was a great leader, but he was never the president of China. They asked him, why don't you become president of China? He says, no, there are younger people who can do that job. And he says, these young people who should do this job must be more educated. Of course, they were a little bit biased towards technical education, so many of them ended up being engineers. And by the way, I am an engineer, and I'm not campaigning to be a leader of a nation. And of course, we know what happened. Jiang Zemin, who came and became the leader of China, Of course, we know Jiang Zemin by his philosophical outlook. The three representatives, you should go and learn about the three representatives, was an electrical engineer from Shanghai. Of course, he was followed by Hu Jintao. And Hu Jintao was a civil engineer. He actually went to Tsinghua. Of course, we know Hu Jintao by his influential philosophy, scientific development. Very, very important that if you develop and you don't link your development to scientific thought, you shall not develop at all. Then came the current president of the People's Republic of China, President Xi Jinping, and a chemical engineer. It's quite interesting, isn't it? All of them are engineers. Of course, we know his theory. Ambassador, you can correct me here. Is socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era. Very, very important. And this new era, and I read The Governance of China, Volume 1 and Volume 2. I read one chapter that I particularly liked was a chapter when he was talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Because this new era is the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Is the era where technology must become ideology instead of anything else. Where technology, if you do not master technology as part of your developmental agenda, then you are not going to develop at all. This is very, very important. It is those things that we want our students to learn. We want our students to learn best ideas from all over the world so that they can be able to craft a society that shall make choices that will maximize development, not only for South Africa, but for the rest of the African continent. So, I know, David, you gave me a speech and I'm off script. So this is very, very important initiative. What I would like to encourage all of us is to think outside the box. The solutions that we require to tackle, certainly as South Africa, the solutions that we require to tackle our problems are difficult solutions. The amount of effort that we need to put into place in order for us to move South Africa forward is going to take more than words. And in this regard, I am reminded of the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah is somebody that we should study very, very seriously. He had many mistakes. One of his first mistakes was that he did not sufficiently concentrate on what happens domestically. And ultimately, he was overthrown. And when he was overthrown, he was actually in China. He was on a state visit in the People's Republic of China. And then he was informed that he is no longer the head of Ghana. And later on, when I was reading the autobiography of Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, he said in the Commonwealth meetings, it became quite a regular thing that every now and then they will be sitting there and somebody will come and whisper on the ear of one of the leaders from our continent to inform them that there was a coup and they are no longer actually supposed to be in that meeting. Of course, the coups now are fewer. We hardly have any coups now. But the work still needs to be done. Now, going back to Kwame Nkrumah, as he was speaking to young people, and he says to them, think. That was the first statement that he said. Think. Never before we need more thinkers. Not just thinkers, but thinkers of great thoughts. Very, very important. And he says, never before, Africa needs more doers, but doers of great deeds. This was like almost 50 years ago when he said this, more than 50 years ago, in fact. That statement is as valid today as it was valid then. And it's the responsibility of this generation to make sure that we start thinking about great thoughts and we start doing great deeds. Very, very important. Because economic development cannot wait. And economic development delayed means poverty extended. And poverty extended means people die prematurely. People who otherwise could have received good education and go on to change the world are left on the dustbins of irrelevance. Costly to the economy. The economic cost of that is more than we can ever quantify by dollars. Very, very important. So, as we think and as we do and as we engage, and we should do much more of that, we should always remember that the measure of how effective our thinking is, or how effective our deeds are, is by how much quantitatively those deeds and thoughts change people's lives for the better. That is really what it is all about. The People's Republic of China had a mission that by 2020, they are going to eliminate poverty altogether from their society. I think they have achieved that before time. 2018, poverty has effectively been eliminated. And by the way, if you study that, you will realize that it is the largest movement of people from poverty that the world has ever seen. So there's something that we can learn. So we should go there and study what has been done and copy the good things that have been done so that we are also able to take, and we have hundreds of millions of people that needs to be taken out of poverty in our continent. And it is not going to come from speeches. It is going to come from deeds. One of the things that I always criticize myself and many people in South Africa here is that we talk too much. We actually do talk too much. And, when I became a vice chancellor, I was actually making a remark that I have realized that now I talk much more than I used to talk. I used to always give a 5-minute speech, and it will be a very long speech. Engineers are trained to always speak less. So, and talking, there's nothing wrong with talking. But if it comes at the expense of doing, then we have a problem. So talking too much and doing too little is a problem. And this is the problem that we need to to untangle as Africans. So the world is very exciting. We are living in a world where automation is becoming a common thing. We are living in a world where the machines are becoming intelligent. They call it artificial intelligence. I actually did a PhD in artificial intelligence at Cambridge from 1997 to 2000. So we need to educate our people so that they understand the world as it is, and hopefully they can be able to imagine the world as it should be. I'm glad to say that the University of Johannesburg has just become the first university in the world to publish a children's book on artificial intelligence so that young people can be able to learn from that. I'm also glad, Ambassador, to say that as I speak, a Chinese translation is being finalized so that it cannot just be the issue of people here who can be able to read it. Of course, as we were doing the storyline, we realized that the cultural context is very, very important, because we use somebody going to skate as an example. And of course, if you translate it to my language, we don't even have a word for skating. You know, of course, so somebody says, you know, our Chinese translator says, the only problem is that many young Chinese, you know, they spend more time studying. So the idea of going out to skate is a bit out of context in terms of culture. So we had to change the storyline. Somebody was sitting behind the desk to try to explain artificial intelligence. So thank you very much for listening. Ngiyabonga. Sheshe.
As we go into the next session, I think we want to just remind that we should hang on, stay on, because it's only those of us who are going to reach the end of the day that will get a copy of the book that was launched this morning. I mean, if you go early, you lose the book. So, you do not want to lose knowledge, knowingly. The next session will actually be run by my colleague, Dr. Cobus van Staden, whom I would like to invite to come over, and who will then in turn introduce the speakers. And the speakers for the next session, I would like to call you to the front. Cobus, kindly come over. Cobus van Staden. As Cobus makes his way, we want to also see the speakers for the next session also come over. Okay, so as our speaker makes his way, we have our chair here, Cobus van Staden, whom I'm glad to introduce as an old friend. Dr. Cobus van Staden is a senior researcher focusing on Africa-China relations at the South African Institute of International Affairs, which is a very important think tank on the African continent. He focuses on foreign policy, geopolitics, and development in the Africa-China relationship. And I should add that he's also focused on matters to do with media and public diplomacy. Cobus van Staden holds a PhD from University of Nagoya in Japan, and he has published widely on Asia-Africa relations. Some of his recent works, including at the South African Institute of International Affairs, include publications on how China has reshaped Africa's engagement with the G20 and how Africa exercises agency in its relations with China. He is, perhaps even more important for some of us, the co-host of the China-Africa podcast, which he does with a colleague called Eric Olanda. And for those of you who are familiar with this, it has been going on for nearly 7 years. It is a podcast with various Africa-China experts from around the world. And anytime you feel like you're tired with reading or looking at books, you can actually go listen in, and you'll just get as good knowledge as anywhere else. I would therefore like to invite Cobus to come over and take over the session from this point onwards. A round of applause for him as he comes over.
Thank you so much for the applause, and thank you so much to the University of Johannesburg for having me. Thank you. This session focuses on Africa's industrialization, and particularly the role of China in Africa's industrialization. And we have really amazing speakers here. First off, we have Mr. Akabondo Kabechani. He is a monitoring and evaluation expert with wide experience in energy policy reform at the Policy Monitoring and Research Center, a public policy and research think tank based in Lusaka in Zambia. He focuses a lot on energy reform, on the local impact of issues like energy tariffs. And he's a published researcher on these issues and a graduate of the University of Witwatersrand and the University of Zambia MBA candidate, focusing on Zambia's state-owned power sector company reforms. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Kabechani.
So my presentation is basically focusing on understanding Africa's energy needs with specific focus on Zambia because as an institution, Policy Monitoring and Research Center, we have mainly focused on trying to reform Zambia's power sector through reform, I think, that we started a long time ago, and which is, of course, beginning to bear fruit. So we have done several studies. My presentation has been focused, I think, on a span of about 6 research reports and 6 studies, which have employed different methods from comparative analysis to using regression models to try and simulate some of the impacts, I think, from policy reform in the power sector. So to kickstart, I think, my presentation, of course, you'll note that about 640 million Africans have no access to power. Power in Africa, I think, is critical for driving our development agenda. And access to energy, of course, is crucial, not only for the attainment of health and education outcomes, but also, of course, I was saying access to energy is crucial, not only for the attainment of health and education, but also for reducing the cost of doing business and unlocking Africa's economic potential. Of course, when we look at power sector reform in Africa, you'll notice that it has moved at a very slow pace, I think for several reasons. One of the reasons is, of course, reform in the power sector has been heavily politicized. And so I think this constitutes part of the challenge. And so in trying to, I think, establish a case for reform in Zambia, we have tried to conduct several studies, I think, to try and set a framework for success. And most of the issues that we have raised in the Zambia power sector market have had to do with, I think, some key principles that we have proposed to the Zambian government, of course, to try and establish a framework of success. One of the issues, of course, has been to try and make tariff reform a part of a comprehensive strategy, of course, to improve generation capacity. If you look at most African countries, you'll notice that supply of electricity has always lagged behind demand, and this has created deficits. We have experienced this in South Africa as well. The other principle, of course, is establishing a clear communication strategy with transparent access to information, which is important for reform, and phasing in of energy tariffs. During our comparative analysis of countries, I think, that have attained better success, looking at, of course, countries like Kenya, which have been successful in reforming their power sector, we realize that phasing in tariffs, of course, over a long period of time usually 3 to 7 years, has had an impact of success. We also looked at combining tariff reform with improvements to state-owned enterprises. Most state-owned enterprises in Africa are largely inefficient, and I think this has created problems for reform. Other issues have to do with targeted mitigating measures to protect the poor, as well as depoliticizing the price setting by setting up an independent regulator. So when we look at some of the challenges that we have faced as a country, of course, you will see that economic transformation over the last 25 years in Zambia has seen national income more than triple. And some of the underlying problems and challenges that we've had have had to do with our dependence on hydro power systems. The case of South Africa, of course, has dependence on thermal, which is, I think, above 90%. In the case of Zambia, of course, we looking at dependence of hydro up to about, I think, 83% with other power sources. So we have done some simulations, I think, to try and project power sector demand by up to 2030. And some of the high case scenarios, of course, show us that power demand in Zambia will triple by as much as 3 times by the time we reach 2030. And we have tried to come up with some of the solutions, I think, to try and deal with some of the challenges that we're currently facing. So when we look at Zambia's total generation capacity, you see that it's around 2,897 megawatts. Of course, something very small compared to the power sector in countries like South Africa. So one of the challenges, of course, that we're currently facing, I think, is the issue to do with climate change and its effects. And you see from some of the studies that we've done, looking back to 2014, 2015, when we had massive droughts, and we had to import power, which cost us, I think, in the excess of $350 million. We've come back to the same situation even this year, where we are currently experiencing power shortages due to climate change and reduced water levels from some of our dams. And so there have been proposals, of course, from the power sector company and government to try and increase tariffs. If you look at the Southern African power pool, you notice besides Angola, Zambia has the lowest electricity tariff rate. What this means is that government has had to subsidize the cost of electricity for industries such as mining, which is the largest consumer of electricity in Zambia, standing at 50%, as well as domestic consumers, I think, who sit at 30%, and the other sectors consume the other 20% remaining. And so we have tried to develop a framework to move towards cost reflectivity. But of course, there are certain rules that we have to follow, I think, to reach or attain this objective. So we have basically tried to establish, I think, a policy environment where we can make it easy or create enabling factors for more investment, private sector investments. Currently, the Zambian government, of course, is constrained, has got fiscal constraints, and is unable to continue investing in the power sector. One of the largest projects, I think, being driven by China to invest in Zambia's power sector is a hydropower station with a capacity of 750 megawatts at a cost of around $2 billion US. And so we have, I think, tried to showcase pipeline projects to open up investment in the power sector, and learned, I think, from comparative experience and adapted these experiences, I think, to the Zambian situation to try and create an enabling environment for power sector investments. One of the issues, of course, that has been problematic from our research that we've noticed in the sector is the issue to do with planning, procurement, as well as creditworthiness of the off-taker, which is a power sector company that is owned by the state. And so we have developed some policy recommendations emanating from our research, done some impact assessments to try and demonstrate how, for example, increasing a tariff will impact on poverty. Of course, our recent proposal to increase tariffs by around 113%, an average of 113%, which is huge, was largely, I think, rejected by many cross-sections of society, despite the fact that we have a problem where electricity is being subsidized. Sorry for the disruptions. And so, looking at creditworthiness of the off-taker, which would be, in our example, the case of Eskom, but our equivalent of Eskom in Zambia, we look at power losses, I think, that are incurred during transmission and distribution, and how much progress I think we've made in trying to reform the power sector. Then we also look at our independent regulator and how much we've moved in terms of reform to try and create an enabling environment for our regulator to operate. And so we identify that it's important that we have a transparent, fair, and accountable regulator. So, coming down to, I think, some of the recommendations, policy recommendations that have come out of our research, we have looked at establishing, I think, a central planning function. Obviously, this to sit in the Ministry of Energy, as well as establishing a central procurement unit, because issues of procurement, I think, have been largely problematic due to capacity issues, as well as, I think, developing monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to try and assess periodic progress. And so you see that when you come down to Africa in its entirety, I think power sector reform has been slow, and it has slowed down the pace of investments in Africa. And further, you see that among the critical policy reforms, I think, that we have tried to put in place to clarify roles and responsibilities between utilities and government, trying to move towards cost-reflective tariffs, the need to have a transparent regulator, build capacity for least cost dynamic generation and expansion activity, unsolicited bids in some of the power sector companies in Africa, I think, have resulted in higher cost of projects. So we have found ourselves in a situation where we have procured projects which are expensive, and governments have been forced to subsidize these projects. Also, we've tried to build common policies and laws and guiding mechanisms, particularly for power pools, such as the Southern African Power Pool, as well as building effective M&E systems. So to conclude, We would say African countries' reform priorities and programs must focus specific attention and on political dynamics. When we look at the case of political dynamics, I think this is a common problem, I think, that spans across many African countries that have been struggling to reform the power sector. And so factoring reasonable understanding of all the stakeholders, effective communication with the public for broad-based support, and analyzing, I think, characteristics of different players and interest groups is essential to having durable and effective reforms. Thank you very much.
Okay, actually, our actual next speaker is Professor Mese Tefera. He is from Ethiopia. He was born in 1975. He's an associate professor of socioeconomic development planning and environmental studies at the College of Development Studies at Addis Ababa University. He has engaged in teaching, research, and consultancy activities in Ethiopia for more than 2 decades, and has published numerous journal articles in the field of socioeconomic development, environment and resource management, climate-smart economic activities, and international bilateral relations. Professor, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Masai Mulugeta. I'm from Ethiopia, Addis Ababa University. I'm also visiting scholar of this Africa-China or Center for Africa-China Studies. And my topic is about overview of Ethiopia-China infrastructure cooperation, and I organized my presentation in this way, just a glance at the conceptual issues, and then Africa or Ethiopia-China relationships, and the contemporary infrastructural cooperations in Ethiopia and China, and finally the concluding remark. So as you all know, when we talk of infrastructure, it is a fundamental facilities and systems serving a country, including the services and the facilities necessary for the economic functions in a country. So it is composed of both public and private facilities like railway, roads, electric networks, telecommunications, and the like. So usually scholars in this field of study divide infrastructure into two: the hard infrastructures and the soft ones. And the hard infrastructure relates to roads, railways, and the like, and the soft ones are the institutions, policies, and laws. So with this understanding, when you go to the Africa-China relations, as it was stated by His Excellency Dr. Arkabe Kubai this morning, the relationship between Africa and China is not recent. It goes back to even 10th century BC, as you can see here from the slide. Some 12,000 years back, there was a trade relationship between Alexandria, one of the cities of Egypt, and the Chinese. And again, during the early years of Ming dynasty, which means around 1370s and 18, a Chinese mariner, explorer, and diplomatic admiral reached East Africa with the name Zheng He. I don't know if I pronounced it very correctly. And this time was before the coming of the European explorer Vasco da Gama in the 16th century. And in fact, when we see the case of the modern Afro-Asian relationship, it started in 1955 during the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, where about 30 African and Asian countries met and discussed on the political issues, economic issues, cultural exchanges, and the like. Of the African countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, Ghana, Sudan, and Liberia participated in this historical conference, which opened door for the collaboration or the relationship between Asia and Africa, and specifically China and Africa. And when you come to the Ethiopian case, it was 1956 that the first Ethiopian cultural delegation went to China, and this cultural delegation was assumed to open, or it was a gateway for the relationship that we have these days between Africa and Ethiopia. And then it was 1964 came when the Prime Minister of China visited Ethiopia in 1964. Following this, Ethiopia opened its diplomatic relationship with China in 1970s. And then after the opening up of this diplomatic relationship, Ethiopia and China signed about more than 60 bilateral agreements. I said more than 60, 1971, 88, 2002, and many more. And the important ones came in 1990s, particularly 1996, when Ethiopia and China signed an agreement on trade, economic, and also technological cooperations. Next to that, what comes is the issue of FOCAC in 2003 also, when Ethiopia hosted and co-chaired the second ministerial meeting of the FOCAC held in Addis Ababa in 2003. And then it comes 2010s, where we signed many bilateral agreements again. And interestingly enough, Ethiopia is also one of the countries that have participated or shown interest in the Belt and Road initiatives of Africa. I mean China. And when we come to the topic of the day, my topic on the infrastructural cooperation, one of the key points was reflected in the construction of AU conference in Addis Ababa by the support of the Chinese in the budget of over 200 million US dollars. As you can see from the slide, this very beautiful headquarter was constructed by the support of the Chinese. And then the railway between Addis Ababa and Port Djibouti, which is about 760 kilometers, was also again constructed by the support of the Chinese, with a capital of over 3 billion US dollars. And comes the Addis Ababa Adama Expressway, one of the very nice expressway, the first of its kind in Ethiopia. It is about 85 kilometers, as you can see here on the slide, was also constructed with the collaborations that we have with the Chinese government and the people. It is a 6-lane and very nice and beautiful expressway that we have. And then comes this, another major example is Addis Ababa City Light Railway, which was inaugurated in 2015. And it is about 32 kilometers and constructed with a budget of over 475 million USD, again by the support of the Chinese. And again, as you can see on the slide, we have the national railway network here, and directly or directly the Chinese are involving in the construction of this national network of railways in Addis Ababa. And also, we have a mega airport expansion with a cost of 563 million USD, and again recently finished with the support of the Chinese government again. As part of the expansion, we have one of the most luxurious hotels nearby the airport, which was again constructed by the support of the Chinese. And as you can see on the slide, it is one of the biggest. Even some writers say it is the biggest in Africa, and again one of the most luxury hotels in the continent. And come to the industrial park, we have about 10 industrial parks, very big. Almost in all of the construction of the industrial parks, you observe the involvement of the Chinese directly or indirectly. So, and this one is the special distribution of the industrial park that we have. And one of them is what we call Hawassa Industrial Park. It is called also Eco Park. Why? Because there is no polluted liquid discharge from this park. And again, this park was constructed by the support of all the collaborations that we have with the Chinese. And it was inaugurated in 2016, some 2 or 3 years back. And then comes the recent one, we call Adama Industrial Park, constructed in 145 million USD, and again with the collaboration that we have with the Chinese government. And also, as you can see here, this is some skyscrapers in Addis Ababa, multi-story buildings we have, 30 and more than that we have these days, and indirectly or directly, most of these skyscrapers have been constructed by the Chinese contractors. As you can see here, they are very luxury and again nice skyscrapers we have these days in Addis Ababa. And also these days we are constructing about 10 sugar factories. There are about 10, very big again. And in these industries also you observe the involvement of Chinese directly or indirectly. And then very recently the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, our PM, inaugurated beautification of Addis Ababa with the cost of 250 million USD, and then the fund was entirely obtained from the government of China with the collaboration that we have. We have also electric network here and there, and also roads in and outside of Addis Ababa. So with this, I would like to conclude that the infrastructural cooperation between Ethiopia and China are found to be fundamental, mainly in 2 aspects. One, it creates more investment environment for the government of China, and in the same way, for Ethiopia, it is hugely or massively contributing in the creation of jobs, efficient use of natural resources, technology or skill transfer, and in due course, improving the livelihoods of the society at large. So the collaboration that we have with China these days is really a powerful force and has a great role to play in the promoting of inclusive and sustainable economic development in Ethiopia. So, therefore, in order to make the most out of the infrastructural cooperation that we have, the following points should be taken into account always. One is it must be based on mutual benefit. Not this morning, you remember that there was the issue of colonialism, hegemony, data, and etc. So I strongly recommend it must be based on the mutual benefit for the two countries. The second one is environmental sustainability. And I recommend all the projects to be implemented in Ethiopia, in Africa, must be eco-friendly for the sustainability reasons. The third one I recommend is maximum benefit to the local population. I recommend there should be no displacement, or in case of inevitability, there should be adequate compensation for the local people. And then two parties, China, Africa, or China, Ethiopia, we should be there to fight corruption again. And then there should be mutual promotion and technical support. And I finally recommend quality products and services from China and Africa. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The next speaker is Kofi Kaoko. He is the Managing Director of Stratnum Futures, a scenario planning, futures and energy consulting and advisory firm. He is an alumnus of the Futures program at Oxford University Said Business School, and also he's a director with the South African node of the Millennium Program, a network of affiliates of the Millennium Program in Washington, D.C., that deals with futures and foresight-based activities and produces an authoritative annual publication called The State of the Future. So, Kofi, go ahead.
Why should anybody care about ICT infrastructure in Africa? This is a very basic, rough, I would say, dumbed-down research question that anybody would want to ask. I won't bore you with all the details of quantitative analysis and all the figures, but what I would like to do is I'd like to keep it qualitative enough. I'm going to spend the next maybe 10, 15 minutes sharing with you what I think, why we should care about it, instead of giving you all the big numbers. But first of all, before I get to that, I want to say that ICTs, by principle, are fundamentally integrated into any infrastructure project. You can't talk about any research, or if you want infrastructure, without ICT. And I think that's so important that the question I've asked, I want you to keep that in mind, because hopefully I'll be able to give you some answers. Nimen hao? How do you say that? Wachao Kofi. So I'm still learning, and I'm learning Mandarin, and hopefully I'll be able to give these kind of talks sometime, maybe in the next 5 years in Mandarin. My talk has 4 fundamental points. The first one is to look at the role of ICT. The second one, I'll be able to look at the challenges that ICT will face on the African continent as all these projects developed. The third is to look at the opportunities. And then the fourth is to look at prospects. By prospect, I mean what to come, because I spend a great deal of my time looking at futures type of work and scenario planning. So I'm going to try to sketch, if I could, about 4 scenarios of these ICTs. So here was the question I put up to you, and I hope we'll get some information going forward. But before I get to the role, I thought I would spend a little bit of time looking at very softer issues, because ICTs tend to be hard issues: brick and mortar, build it, the architecture, the policy, and everything else. But there's something we don't talk much about, which are quite soft. And this one is basically perceptions. And perceptions do have values. Why do perceptions have values? Because we can talk about all these. If people think they can't do it, they can't put the ICT infrastructure together, or nobody else can help them, as they've been told for centuries, it becomes very difficult because their perceptions really bind them not to be able to progress. And I think we've heard this morning, our earlier guest, especially Ambassador, I think Song Tiang, making the case that it's also about how we perceive not only ourselves, but how we perceive the world. So our mental models, our mental maps are very, very important. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time there. And the reason why I'm spending time on that is very simple. Africa is a construct. There are 54 African countries. If you count 55 with Western Sahara, which is, if you want an agreement, it's been agreed by the African Union to be one of those countries. But please don't tell the Moroccans about that. It's very important. But what is this construct is such a box, but it's also something that needs to be deconstructed. There are 54 African countries. And I'm going to spend some time showing how the size, the geography, the sense of place, the physical constraints might be and could be both a danger, a crisis, or an opportunity to build ICTs in Africa. I've already spoken about this. So I'm going to take you to looking at perceiving Africa. I won't waste the time on this one. But there's one thing I want to share with you, this science. I think my Chinese audience may recognize this. I hope I didn't get the wrong one, but this is a character that embodies, I've always thought that this is a character that's got 3 people in it. 2 kissing and hugging, and 1, if you want, doing this. But what is important in this character is that it's a Chinese wisdom ideogram, which means both, I understand danger, crisis, and opportunity. And the idea that this character is so powerful is that it tells us that the way people have been perceiving Africa, mainly the West, is mainly in the form of a crisis, of a danger. It's such a bad place, nothing works, and I'm going to spend some time on those things, that you can't do anything else. But not everybody has perceived Africa that way. And I think China, to its credit, has managed to really relook and re-perceive Africa the way perhaps it should be perceived. And out of this new perception, a focus of attention, and creating a new sense of value and a new sense of place where things are possible. And I think that's the ferment, the basis of my talk, that it is possible that ICTs could be a powerful leverage, an enabler, an exponential element to use to really get Africa to go where we want it to go. But before I get there, I want to spend a quick, if you want, short moment around the context, the complexity of the continent, the diversity, everything else you can think of, very complicated, geography, which is basically the sense of place. Many of you already know how big the continent is, 30-something million square kilometers, 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. And supposedly Africa by 2050 will be about 2 to 3 billion more people. That is huge. Lagos alone might have, I understand, I hope I get my figures right, somewhere around 20, 25 million people, or even a little bit more by 2050. Most of the inhabitants will come to the coast and live in the cities. So out of those complexities, how do you build or make sure you have something that's called ICT infrastructure? Of course, the other one is demography that I've mentioned already. The population of the continent is growing very fast. Much younger people are in it. And if younger people are in it, why not put them to work and help them build this infrastructure one way and another? History, I think all of you know the history. It's a history of fragmentation, a history of a construct that belongs to the Berlin Conference about the scramble for Africa. And that scramble is leading to an identity fragmentation of Africans. If you ask all Africans, they'll say, where are you from? I'm from Zambia. I'm from Mali. I'm from Kenya. I'm from so-and-so. All these fragmented sense of geography also add to the fragmentation of the sense of identity. So most often, you will see that those fragmentations have a hold on Africans, so it's difficult to have a unity that's also seamless, and it forces things not to happen. Then what not a best way to have something that can bring everybody together with a language, but most important, the language of technology, information, communication technology is a powerful instrument to bring people together, to bridge through all these barriers of borders that we've seen, against xenophobia, against patriarchy, against anything you can think of. And I think we need to have the agency to be able to do that. Now, the agency is not going to be easy. Do Africans really believe they can make it? And if they can't, who else can remind them that they can make it? And I think China has been reminding us that it's possible. We've seen with evidence, not just only in China, but throughout the world. And we're now seeing in Ethiopia and in East Africa, that a great deal of things are possible. I think that's the key. So ICT will be also something very important to help us grow the African continent. But let me share with you something you already know. There are many forces that are already playing, both against and for Africa. The first set of force you already know about, I called Afropocalypse. Africa and apocalypse coming together. And they're mainly all the forces you know: poverty, inequality, unemployment, crime, corruption, and what I call a basket of intolerances: xenophobia, tribalism. I can give you names and names. So these are some of the biggest challenges that we're facing. And then the next one, the forces of change that can help us have our own agency, that you already know. There are also 6 forces. The first one is great politics. The second one is economic freedom. The third one is culture. The fourth, belief system. We must change the way we believe about ourselves and how things are going. And already there are signs out there that Africans have started to believe differently. The next one is technology. This is exactly what ICTs will do, to bypass some of the most constraining forces that are holding us on the ground. And then the last one, perhaps this should be the first one, education. And I've heard today the earlier delegates talking about education. And here we are. We're in a space where education is very important. A well-educated African with very sound partners will take the continent where it's supposed to be. And so we need a new representation of the mind of ourselves, how we see ourselves, but also how the world sees us. And this new mindset about Africa is not just an elusive story. It is very, very important. When you read the media, you listen to it, I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that CGTN, the China Global Television Network, has been covering Africa much better than the SABC. I mean, I don't tune into SABC anymore. So I try to find ways to educate myself, and I think this is an area where stories are now being told about the continent: business, politics, entertainment, everything else. But still, Africa has been seen as a country. So if you take China and Africa, we see Africa as a country, but perhaps it should be, because this is probably where we're going, because we must deconstruct the idea of a fragmented continent into one. And if you remember President Trump saying that Africa was I don't want to repeat this, but it looks really strange. Well, maybe I should say it, a shithole. And that's the perception people have about the continent: a basket case, famine, violence, ridden by disasters. And here's something I thought you might want to see as well: Chinese takeaway. You know, here's President Xi Jinping, you know, bundling up the continent. So all these sort of pictures are very powerful about the continent. And then here's another one by contrast, where this Chinese couple and family, the mother tells the son, clean your plate, young man. There are starving children in America. Well, I hope and maybe in the next 25 years we could say the same thing about, Africans could say the same thing about somebody else, although it's a bit harsh. But this is it. So the imperative of having a new narrative to re-perceive Africa is essential. But how does that translate into making it possible into what we would call a digital Africa, an infrastructure that is possible, that could help to bring people together, that could help to create economic growth for a sustainable Africa. So both crises and opportunities are very important. They help us to re-perceive Africa, but we must use it in a way that's very helpful. And I'm showing you this picture, Chairman, I know my time probably may be very short, but this picture is a very powerful picture. If you look at it, it's got three movements, three scenarios to it. Those who are pessimistic will see Africa falling off the face of the earth. Do you see that? And there's a hand at the bottom ready to hold and help Africa. If you look at the hands, it's on the left. It's a dark Africa falling off the face of the earth. And if you remember Tony Blair saying that Africa was a scar on the face of the earth and it should fall down. And then the other one, if you're pessimistic enough, you see the hand taking Africa back on the face of the earth. Do you see that? It's in your imagination. You should perceive that. It's a very, very powerful picture. But most important, it is that the eyes that are looking at that future and the hands, many of my students at WITS have always told me, oh my goodness, this is China saving Africa. I never believed in it until I started to see some of the signs. So how do we align our mental model to make sure that we could help a continent create a new digital Africa? But we've seen very soon, and we're seeing that there will be something I call the new digital scramble for Africa. And China is at the center of it. Huawei, Chinese companies in tech and ICT are already dominating the continent by far. But one thing I must say that the research has been trying hard to get is a very specific size, investment, cost, and all the spending about ICT. We can't get it easily. However, because we're academics, we can speculate. So if we're spending, if the relationship between China and Africa is around 130 billion or so, we could assume that part of that, I would say at least, because the first principle I put forward to you was that every big project is an ICT project. I want you to keep that in mind. I would assume that at least half of that money will go to information, communication, and technology. So let me go quickly. Many of you have seen this, the new scramble for Africa by The Economist. For the first time, at least, we get a sense that The Economist is saying, hey, Africans must win out of this new scramble. Will they win? Will we win? Must we win? We don't know. But signs are very encouraging because China is looking at win-win rather than just taking everything off or making sure that Africans benefit from it. And the evidence is already showing. The growth of Africa is intrinsically linked to the growth of China. So is its future. In politics, in many things, I know China doesn't like to talk about politics, but it's true, it's already happening. Same as in economics and same as in ICT infrastructure. So what would be the role? And those roles are very clear. Catalytic, disruptive enabler, that's what the role of ICT will be, a multiplier, exponential, leapfrogging, trickle up for me, but most important, developmental and transformational with the purpose to deal with all the problems that I've mentioned to you, all those big challenges, poverty, inequality, unemployment, crime, and so forth. And so transformation, I think it's very important. Development more so than anything else. What are the challenges? We know them. Geography, regionalization, the size of the continent is so big that it will be difficult to get it right away because of the nature, the constraint of the geography, but also history. Most of our countries are still under the yoke of colonialism. You take West Africa and Francophone Africa, they still look up the French to do things. Some other countries in Southern Africa do the same with Britain. Apocalypse. All the challenges I mentioned about poverty and inequality, they will still hold sway when we talk about the challenges. The biggest challenges I also think about is the digital divide. Some will have more, others will have less. And then what is more important is that one big challenge is the ICT infrastructure policy strategy coherence around regulation and in governance. Africans don't have it yet. However, they're already at continental level with the African Union, some progress. The economics, that's a big challenge. Investment, we don't know how much is going where so far. We're not quite sure where our leaders are directing the funds to build information and communication technologies that are very efficient and radically transforming their lives. And then the cost as well, big cost. Europeans are selling us all kinds of very expensive hardware and software. Luckily enough, we now started to get some alternative with China, Huawei, ZTE, and all the other Chinese companies that are bringing product that are cheaper, but also efficient and very economically powerful because they address our issues. They help us to do things that we didn't do before. And then another challenge is partnership. But I want you to remember that those challenges are also opportunities at the same time. What kind of partnerships are we talking about? All sorts of them, very high yield partnership. Private sector partnership, private and partnerships are very important with the private sector. But most important, our biggest challenge is going to be on execution, speed and outcomes. You know, there's something, I don't know if it's Chinese saying this or in Asia, they say complacency breeds danger. And much of the continent is very complacent about getting things done and moving fast enough. And I think the Chinese have been very irritated about that. For a continent that's sitting on so much, they would want it to go faster. No wonder they're focusing on Ethiopia, which is delivering. Opportunities, I can't go any farther. Economic and social development, growth in the digital economies, employment, infrastructure development, education, job creation. And then another one that I think is also very important is bringing Africa together. ICTs will be able to do that. The connectivity is so essential. People will be able to move about. Ideas will move about as well, so as goods. There are continental strategy, ITC strategies that are placed. The AU Vision is talking about it. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is also there. The regional economic communities are also looking at it. So east, west, north, south, center, a great deal of things are already happening. And what we need is policy coherence to be able to help Africa. I'm almost done. And then the prospects, which means if we're looking forward, what can we expect? To me, I think it's a story of economic growth. I can't talk more about it. I think it's a high road. It's a best case scenario. I don't see it going downward. I see it. It's not a low road. It's a very high road with the help of China. And then so there are a couple of scenario perspectives that I wanted to share with you. But there are also driving forces. Those driving forces, I see four: policy, finances, natural resources, and deals, how Africa can make deals. And then scenario one, I call it Afridomia. Africa grows and then have much better ICT policy infrastructure strategy deals. These are the details. And then the second scenario is what I called Afro-Risia. It's got both Africa rising with Asia. That's a powerful story for me, where a resource-rich continent is now rising with the help of Asian investment in infrastructure, but also gets things done. And then this one I thought it was really interesting because I thought Mandarin could be a very powerful element into all this as a language of commerce going forward. So far, we're not quite sure what would be the language of commerce that will be greatly favorable to Africans. Is it going to be Kiswahili, Of course it is English so far. Is it going to be French? Is it going to be an African language? Or will it be Mandarin? Or how you guys call it? Hanyu. And then the last scenario is what I called Afrocentria, which is basically the one where Africa becomes at the center with all these ICT working very well. So now, the question comes back again. Why should anybody care about the African digital and ICT story? I think we already have the answer to that. It is so important, we have to pay attention to that. And on our Chinese takeaway, if I could say so, I think sound continental ICT policy strategies are necessary, effective partnerships as well. But most important, the last two, sustainable funding and resources. FDI is very, very essential. We don't have resources, it's going to be a problem. But also at the same time, you need competent, educated, skilled, very smart people trained to be able to take the ICT and then run it and make things happen. But most important, the speed of strategic execution. If we don't execute with speed and we wait for another 20 years, I think we'll be back where we were. And so my last message to you is, no ICT infrastructure, no digital development, and no Africa. If there's no ICT infrastructure, there wouldn't be any digital development, nor any Africa. And I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes. How do I know what I think until I see what I say? How do I know what I think until I see what I say? Which means, strategically, for thinking, to talking, to doing. That's what we want for Africa. On this note, I say thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all three of the speakers for these powerful interventions. We have limited time for questions, but I think we have time for about 2. So I can't see very well. Does anyone have a question? Okay, there you go.
Thank you very much. My question is to Kofi. I have truly enjoyed your presentation, and I wonder if you can share that. So the question around the language, you did recommend a number of languages to be used for the commerce between Africa and China and all the other partners. Don't you think it would be a good idea to form with the, using the ICT, all these modern ICT, to form a new language? So maybe the entrepreneurship could be a main component of the language. Because all the language you mentioned could have, how do I put it? You did mention some language that many will feel it's not going to be, applicable to them. But because it's a wonderful partnership between Africa and China. So, and with this modern ICT, we could think of a language that has a lot of entrepreneurship, because this is a continent that has a very entrepreneurial youth and mindset. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take one more question and then we can go to answers.
Hello everyone. I'm a second year student here studying BA in journalism. I had a question, two, for the ambassador. Since he's not here, the gentleman on the stage can take the question. The first question rises on the nature of reciprocity. Fine, I see we have a lot of cultural exchanges program with China, particularly, for example, in the language. When it comes to Mandarin, we see a lot of Africans going to China and even Confucius institutes in universities teaching Mandarin. My question is, how can this relationship be mutually beneficial if there are no cultural programs intended for Chinese to learn about us on the other side? I mean, South Africa itself, officially we have 11 languages, but those have just been simplified. They can be understood to be somewhat over 50. So my point is, if the Chinese are not learning our languages on the other side, how can this relationship be mutually beneficial? And then question number 2, it goes down to the colonization talk. I think when we are speaking from a colonized point of view, it becomes kind of weary because the relationship that China is now sharing with Africa is similarly the same compared to European relationship, because when Africa and Europe started, it started on matters of trade. And now with China, it is moving towards matters of trade as well. So you have to understand, what will this lead to Africa? You get my point? Because now the similarities have been noted. And then the Vice Chancellor spoke, I think, about we need to take more exports into China. We need to access the Chinese market. Fine, that is quite progressive. But we also need to look into the trade deficit between China and South Africa, because we can agree that the number of imports and exports has not been quite balanced, in that it has had quite of a negative effect in South Africa. So I'd like the gentleman to engage on this. And if it has been that I'm incorrect, please do correct me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just for the record, before our speakers answer, there are actually several African language programs at Chinese universities where they teach languages like Hausa, like Yoruba, Kiswahili, and several Southern African languages. So that's just for the point. Yeah, go ahead, to our speakers. I wonder if we can... It's okay, let's
Thanks very much. I think, thanks for your question. I think the first one is the nature of the language. Every powerful moment has a language that really characterizes it. And in world politics and in geopolitics, language becomes the vehicle of that power. And that power can assume many forms. It's got hard part of it and then very soft part of it. The hard part is basically the brutal part of economics. We are powerful, we're going to sell you everything we want to sell you, and this is it. We think it's going to be useful to you, or for you, you take it at the price we dictate. And we've seen that through history. And so that kind of language is still there. It hasn't disappeared. And the history tells us that the evidence of that is still there. It's going to be up to Africans to understand, where do their languages really fit? Do we invest in our languages? That's one thing. You know, how many of you here read in Amharic or in isiZulu? Or what's the latest book that came out on artificial intelligence in isiZulu? Or in Sutu? Or for that matter, for any other African language. And we need to make that very purposeful, powerful decision to decide to invest in our own languages. So I'm responding to you as well, in the corner of my eyes, to say that it's not about the Chinese only to say we want to learn, you know, Mandarin or any other Chinese languages. It's also up to us to decide what we think. If it's a win-win opportunity, we have to do our parts to be able to teach our languages. Try to go and then take a lesson in isiZulu in most of our universities. It costs you more money than anything else. So the cost of entry to learn our languages are so almost impossible unless you go and live into places where people are. We don't have the materials. So in short, we haven't invested in them. So you can't accuse the Chinese for having done their part. They're doing their parts. So it is something that we need to look at in ourselves. But there is another language, the language of technology, which is basically a code that everybody understands. So we can work with that, we can start with that. And then on top of it, we can start building other languages of value. And any language that usually doesn't have economic power, this is a principle, is bound to disappear. And most languages disappear anyway. So if this one doesn't have any economic power, it will disappear. If Kiswahili is not taught in schools and I can't do business with it, why should I care learning it? It's a tough one for me to say. So if your mother tongue is a great language and you're not investing in it, you're not putting enough resources to make sure it survives, it will die. That's very simple. Now, very quickly, on the colonized relationship with Africa, of course, you have a point. Many, especially in the West, are punting that China is the new colonizers. It's a very good propaganda narrative, and it works very well, and you can see it because they can show you the evidence. But wait a minute, who was there before? And not only who was there before, who is still there? And who still owns the African continent? Do you have a piece of it? Do you have a piece of land? Do you have a piece of the mines in the African continent? Who is still colonizing it? So it's not just China. China is a very early arrival, and they haven't even done much, at least for their arrival. But for what we're seeing is, it's a sign that we need to find alternative to trying to figure out how do we get out of our mess. And if you have alternatives, share them with us. It's not just to say that China is a colonizer. It's a good thing to say. Or saying the West is also a colonizer, but do we have alternative for our own selves? Do we have a plan going forward for the continent? Everybody else does for Africa. So where are our plans? And then on the trade deficit, I mean, frankly, Chinese are saying it's a win-win. What else do you have? And let me digress very quickly, but I'll be short. I have Japanese clients, and we're having conversations about Africa and Japan. And I kept complaining all the time that, gosh, things are not working, and so and so. And the lady client said to me, Kofi, you know, every time I listen to you, things are going bad in Africa. You know, South Africa is 1.24 something million square kilometers. Japan is about maybe a quarter of a little bit over that. 3 islands. Every year we have more than 100 earthquakes. What else? I mean, we don't have all the minerals we have. You have 2/3 of the world platinum, gold, everything else. What are you complaining about? The weather is fine. You have a Kruger National, I mean, the wealth we have, we're not even aware of it. And I kept complaining. And they told me, go back and work. It's a tough one, but it's a powerful reminder. So in short, we have to do our part before we complain.
Okay, I think we are quite on time, I should say. Thanks for the speakers as they make their way off the stage. We now go into the last session, and I can see the number of the copies of books, of the books that were launched today, will be distributed fairly. Those of us who have remained, we might actually lobby that we get 2 copies each. So things are, you know, hang on there, don't move an inch, and we'll be fine. And so we go therefore now into the last session, and our colleague who is on the stage, Mr. Moab Merid, Managing Executive Director of Infra Group in Ethiopia. I think Ethiopia has done very well for this conference because I can see Gideon Gelata somewhere in the audience as well. I think we should say this was South Africa, Ethiopia, China conference. As you can tell from my accent that I'm Kenyan, so I might be feeling terrible that representation at speech is not... Yeah, but quickly, let me introduce Mr. Moab Merid, who is the only speaker in this session. He's a Group Executive Director of Infra Group, which is a diversified group of companies in financial services, industry, investment, and integrated project development, operating in the new frontier markets of Africa and Middle East. And I think we want to mark the word new frontier, meaning that there are new and innovative and novel things happening there. He has a career history as a senior positions within the multinationals in the financial sector, in the telecom sector, and in project development arena. He's a specialist in matters financial engineering, integrated finance, and transport, infrastructures, natural resources, mining, and industries. And I guess we shall see some of his experience in these fields coming out of as he speaks. And he has over 20 years of experience in the corporate business, in the corporate and business worlds, in terms of transactional and advisory services, and has quite a track record in those respects. And I think I can go on and on, kind of elevating and speaking about his many achievements, but I think one of the more important things is we want to see his presentation and then interact with it, and after that have a question and answer session. Welcome, Mr. Merid. A round of applause for him.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the University of Johannesburg for giving me this opportunity to discuss about the ETO-China Industrial Cooperation and the impact it has had in Africa and what we call, as an investment banker, the frontier markets and a new opportunity for all us Africa. I've tried to change my speech several times so that I don't want to bog you down with empirical-based data research or report, but I would like to give you my perspective of this aspect of the topic from investment background in infrastructure and industrial development. Before I dive into the topic that we'll be discussing, let me give you my African perspective that I have for us. As we all know, generational change of all Africans as how we address the hope and the dream that we instill to our young men and women if they go to school and learn and work hard, that they have a set life for the future and a successful citizen in their respective countries. This reality today, 60% of African population is under 25. The shoulder of history is upon us as we Africans, that we have to make our own destiny with the right strategic partners. If we fail to address these challenges to a greater or lesser degree, this generation has no excuse or blame other external factors. The deprivations that we've seen in various manifestations across the African continent of lack of opportunities for the young is a making of our own fortunes. We cannot afford to blame external factors in the past as we've done it. The destiny of our continent is within our own hands. With that in that background, I would like to continue the ETO-China Industrial Cooperation from the perspective of industrial transformation of Ethiopia in the African continent, context. Let me give you my life journey in a short summary so that I can integrate it in how we see this industrialization. I was brought up from a family who have instilled in me that a generational ideal on good education, Christian values, humility, love of the country, and a Pan-Africanist view of that's what my family comes from. If I work hard, there is a dream out there that I can be successful. When I turn around today, have I passed on that with the limited resources that my parents have to this new generation of 60% of the population of Africa under 25, that hope. A hope that having an opportunity in working hard and dreaming and achieving that reality, is it there? One way of this critical generational call that we can address of such kind of industrial cooperation is with China. Over the last 25 years, which I don't want to repeat and bog you down with figures and others, in the context of my country of birth of Ethiopia and China, have engaged in multifaceted, mutually beneficial, two-way economic partnership. This journey of partnership has resulted in economic benefication where Chinese expertise, finance, goods and services have been used to develop the basic infrastructure, as quite rightly said earlier, transport, energy, and others in the early years, and it has still continued. In the last 15 years, what we've seen is a huge influx of industrial development engagement in Ethiopia. Mark my polemics that I've been using. The keyword, industrial development engagements. I have not used the word foreign direct investment or inflow. I'll come back to you why I've said that. Because this industrial development engagement has three forms, in my view. One, in building the industries or transferring the technology on the ground. The second one is transferring the skills, the expertise in depth and profile. Coming from a low skill base of my country of birth, the efficiency in the productivity through constructive engagement with Chinese industrialists in Ethiopia. In some parts of the industrial parks that you've seen have excelled the operational efficiency of European manufacturing base as we speak today. Some of these industrial skills that have been transferred in a very short time, that's what we're talking about, a win-win cooperation. Building a factory anywhere in the African continent without having the necessary skills to equip the young generation is a failure on its own right. It's not that these are not only two factors that one has to see. The third and most important factor is creating and access the market. Many of you have said that we don't have access to the Chinese market or the other European market. As one of the clients that we have advised over the years as a business advisory services, and from the United Kingdom, they have been advocating to enter the Ethiopian market. Perhaps some of you know the Marks and Spencers and others that have been buying garments, whatnot, from the Far East and China and Vietnam, whatnot. We have the industrial parts that produce this, but we don't have the access to the market purely because we don't have the skill base and the qualitative work that is required. That is the transformational agenda that Africa should be challenging in this win-win industrial cooperation that we have to face in this century. That is the call of the day, and that is the challenge. Each and every young population that is coming through educational system, it's a hope that by belonging to this continent, at the end of the day, they have a future where they can live at ease within themselves. If we fail to address that, so such kind of industrial cooperation and creative massive employment opportunity, we have failed as a generation. That includes my generation as well, first and foremost. On the other hand, the dreams are gone that the transformational economic regeneration can only come from historical and traditional legacy economic development partners. They are part of the solution, but one cannot ignore or demonize the positive contribution that the Chinese have made on the African continent. Development partners, yes, they are. Is it a mutually beneficial relationship? Of course it is. But we have to reconcile and get this message across to the new developmental realities of the world. In the case of Ethiopia, 1/4 of the foreign direct investments in the year 2018 has come from China. What I call a constructive Chinese engagement. There are about 400 Chinese investment projects valued at more than $4 billion in Ethiopia today. Each and every one of them as a core employment creation and industrial transformation. To date, they have created over 500,000 direct employees over the cumulative years. As I said to you from the starting of my discussion, I come from an investment banking background from the United Kingdom. I have transformed myself as a group, as an industrialist in Ethiopia. When we started our investment in industry, the three things that I've mentioned to you were critical. Today, the group that I lead is the biggest cement factory owner, which Dr. Arkaba told you earlier, through Chinese technology. We directly employ about 500 people, and each and every one of them have got a skill transfer from the Chinese operational maintenance staff. Our operational efficiency in this particular investment, from the low operational efficiency when we started the operation of under 20%, currently we've achieved 95% of operational efficiency. That's what we are talking about, transformational agenda and positive engagement. It's no brainer to have a facility, a white elephant anywhere in the African continent. Let me repeat this to you. The issue is, how do we bring this opportunity for the generational call that I've said to you earlier? The manifestation of the social problems that we see across the continent, from wherever down in South Africa to the country of my birth, to the migration that we see in the northern part of Africa, is a failure of collective African leadership over the years, which I account for that as well, personally. With that in mind, I think with the industrialization contribution for Africa and the Chinese partnership has to be perceived in those three pillars that I've mentioned to you. But I don't want to conclude my speech without mentioning something about my core expertise, which is finance and the date issue that is revolving around Africa regards to this infrastructure development and industrialization. As Africans, we need to learn a homegrown solution for the ever-growing demand of the financial requirement that this growth requires. This African solution has to have a paradigm policy shift in the way we look at the financial sector in addressing the infrastructure deficits and also the industrial development requirements. Some of it, what over the years that the Chinese have done, is a capacitative development of homegrown financial institutions that have addressed the financial gaps of their own country developmental needs. Africa needs to think out of the box and come up with the capacity that will enable it to have a homegrown financial institutions that could address this date issue that is hanging on our shoulders. We need to think out of the box how we can address it. Policymakers have to address these issues that have been pressed as a fear factor, that opening, reforming the financial services will have its own implication of drawbacks in the host countries. Various kinds of policy impediments are there, even for the continued Chinese investment. And certainly in the greater African continent, the FX issue or foreign currency issue needs to be addressed. They will continue to invest. They are committed to invest in our countries. But however, there has to be a mutually beneficial relationship for both. Investment decisions are based on a return on investment that we made. Our financial services or sector is not up to par. Probably in the country that you are in South Africa, might be open. The rest of Africa has a long way to go. But it has to be homegrown solutions, as we have announced it in our country recently. With that, I conclude my speech and I thank you all.
No, I think you can take a seat. Just a quick one to say, I think Mr. Merida has been very pragmatic in his presentation. And in fact, we have saved a couple of minutes. We said 15, you finished in less than that. And this tells you that people who are focused like him, who are business-oriented, no, when the pitch is over, don't say one word more. And yeah, I mean, this is actually reminded me of, some of my students at WITS the other day. One student actually rose in class to say, no, look, there's a Chinese saying that says, it doesn't matter whether a cat is white or black, as long as it can catch mice. So I was like, okay, is it a Chinese saying or it was said by a Chinese leader? It's like, no, it's a Chinese saying. Generally, it's a very ancient. So one of the students then said, no, look, it was said by a Chinese leader. So then we went back to the first student to ask, who is the Chinese leader who said, it doesn't matter what the color of the cat is, as long as it can catch mice. So like, obviously, Mao Zedong. So we all laughed quite a bit because it's actually Deng Xiaoping. And I'm saying this because David is here somewhere in the audience. If David Monyae, If you look at the icon on his phone, it's actually Deng Xiaoping holding a cat that is both white and black. And I think how that relates to his presentation is that it's very pragmatic. You know, it doesn't go too much into research and research findings. It's saying, look, we are doing things. We are putting up cement factories and so forth. That will be my intervention. But I think we have an opportunity for comments, questions, 2 or 3 or 4 directed to him. And the light is quite bright here, but I can see 2 already, 1, 2. I wonder if I can, it's just those 2. Any other on this side? Is this the intellectual Siberia of some kind? I think we have these 2, so let's start with the first one there, then we come to you. Okay. So just listen in, then you can respond. Okay, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Speaker. My name is Enoch Pepra, CEO of Pepra and Associates. It's a consulting firm based in Johannesburg. The 2, comments and a question. I mean, in the last discussion, we were just talking about a common language. Do we really have to scratch our head? I mean, sign language is common language, and we can all learn it. You don't need any, apart from the one who was translating at Mandela's funeral. I think, And the second point I think nobody really touched on is the cost containment in infrastructural projects. I think we focus on infrastructure, and the impression I got is that the Chinese are able to contain costs. I mean, if you take examples, in South Africa, if you look at Kusile and Medupi power projects, I mean, the cost overruns were just, unbelievable. How is it possible to contain costs in these infrastructure projects? Thanks.
Thanks. I think let's take the second question so that then you can respond to both. I think you have to, then after that, we'll be wrapping down the session here.
Thank you. Mine will be very short. You did touch base on the finance and the financial institutions in Africa. And we understand that almost 70 million Africans are in unbankable situation. And now a partnership like now between China and Africa, how will that work when a large number of the population are in unbankable situation? But having said that, and I think I should bring the innovation made by Kenya, so then at least there is mention in your country, the M-Pesa, which has been innovatively created in an African country, not digitally developed, maybe Western country, is also a successful, digital mobile way of transferring funds from one area to the other. So maybe you should just please share with us some insights around these. Thank you.
If you would excuse me, the first question that you asked about the common language and sign language, I didn't quite get it, so I will have to ask you to repeat it. But let me start with the second point that you raised about infrastructure development. As you can see from, probably this question is arose from the profile that you've read about the project execution capabilities that have been involved in various parts of the world. One of the key lessons that I have learned in terms of the cost containment is the issue of planning. Any project, if you fail to plan, you have planned to fail. There is a famous quotation. I'll repeat it. If you fail to plan, you have planned to fail. The particular case that you mentioned in energy generation, Madube power plant, I really don't know the details, but I can certainly read subjective issues that the project have cost overrun. But it looks to me that whoever the project implementers have planned or have failed to plan. And by that, they have planned to fail. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, in terms of the project implementation, no two projects are the same. Project is dynamic. Projects have life. Projects have to be addressed in a very proactive and reactive, sometimes, way of addressing the various challenges as they go along. And that is where the cost containment comes in. Unless you have the right expertise, resources in place, or if you don't have any sinister motive to circumvent the objective of the goal that you've set for the project, these factors can happen, but they have to be mitigating circumstances. That's how I see it. And I'll ask you to repeat this first question later. And the second one, which is an area of passion and interest to me, is about the financial access to the greater unbankable society in Africa. I forgot the name of the gentleman who explained to us about ICT. I think we Africans have underestimated the impact that ICT will have in the transformational agenda that this country or this continent requires. ICT is an enabler tool, in my view. The basic things that how transactions could be done, from telemedicine to educational establishments, from financial inclusion to other areas where we are lacking access for basic infrastructure. With that in mind, I'm one of the secret admirers of success of M-Pesa. In fact, to be honest with you, I always have challenge of accepting my own country regulators of Ethiopia, how they can remain for so long with this kind of drive to change the society, that they have closed the financial services for the unbankable on a technology-based access. We are a country of 110 million people, and one of the professors that presented here was asking me, what's my take in having these branches, corners after corners, and are we really achieving the banking access for the greater mass? My answer to that, my brother, 60% of the branch operation, the physical branch networks that we have in Ethiopia are unprofitable, especially in urban areas. If we do not have a technology-enabled solution where a rural farmer can check the price of the goods that they're selling out in the market instantly, where he can be paid instantly for the products that they've produced, we are denying the opportunity in many aspects, as I've said, on the industrialization process that we have defined earlier. It is one of the generational calls. Again, I would like to use this thing, that we have to be transformative in our agenda. And the only thing that we have to challenge is the fear that has been installed over the years of not going into untouchable areas where we can bring the transformational agenda. With that, I would like to ask the gentleman about the common language, which, if you don't mind, if you can repeat that question.
Well, that's supposed to be a facetious comment in the sense that we're grappling about universal language for commerce. And I say, well, sign language is universal enough. Why do we have to just scratch our head and think about something else? But it was facetious, you know. Okay, thanks.
Language is a medium of communication, and as Africans, whether it's sign language or Mandarin or others, we, as a continent, need to establish a medium of communication that is higher than the current requirements in terms of addressing our understanding and integration. I think that's how I see it. I don't know if I've addressed that.